Hello. So, I have a lot of people talking to me about couples and communication and triggers. And so, I thought I would just create this module, this lesson about how to support one another. So, there are a couple of things. Okay, so for one, I want to start with this. Let's talk about what happens when one person is triggered and the other person is not triggered. And then I want to talk about more of like an interaction where you're both triggering one another. So we know if you read there are countless places where I talk about triggers in the training zone. So if you're not exactly sure what a trigger is, you can go back and read more. I put a little bit of a summary in the notes in the actual written part here. But being triggered is actually a physical thing that happens to us, and it happens to all of us, and it is not a bad thing. And I really do believe that we need to normalize triggers and normalize that they happen to people because it is a normal body function. But here's the thing about it. It is normal, and it is also something that we don't need to just accept that we'll always be triggered. There are ways that we can actually work through our triggers. There's healing at the actual root level of the trigger, and that's why I created the Trigger Trail Buddy, because that helps a person to be able to go through and actually discover what it is at the root of why we're triggered. And then there's also the meditation, which is you've just been triggered meditation, which guides you back to a little more centered place. But there are all kinds of things we can also do proactively to get our nervous system in a better position, like where we actually heal our nervous system a little bit more. And so I really do believe that if you're interested in actually being less triggered from your past, then there's a lot that you can do. So I've included some of that below or above. I'm not sure where it shows up on the screen for you, whether you're on your phone or your computer. And but I've also included, I also want you to understand how you can support one another in a couple when there's a triggered situation. So for one, what's most important for a person to know is that when we're triggered, we are actually not in the part of our brain that allows us to be like socially engaged or to think of the other person that much. It's really a time where we become hyper focused on our safety and security. And that safety and security isn't just, so the reason why it was this part of us was formed, or where we evolved, which is the ego defense mechanism, it evolved to keep us safe, animals and humans to survive. And the reason that you are here right now is because of your ancestors and you having a well-honed fear response, fight, flight, freeze response system that knows how to protect yourself in a dangerous situation. But what's happened is there are a couple things. So one thing is that because of the world we live in right now, and I really believe because of the constant onslaught of information and lack of sleep and stress, that we do actually live in a more heightened state. And so I do believe that there are some contributing factors societally right now that are making us more hyper vigilant. But I think at the root, so my point is, I think that there are things that happen and our brain perceives them to be dangerous. Like you can get an email from somebody who is really like maybe short and abrupt with you, and that can sometimes really throw us off and make us feel like scared inside, that like, oh, this person's disappointed in me, I let them down. Or there could be even like you get like, maybe you're not sure if you might get fired from your job or something. And so there can be ways where maybe your actual physical life isn't threatened, but psychologically and emotionally you do feel threatened. Or maybe your security financially feels threatened. And so there are ways we are triggered by present day situations that do require us to sort of process those things and really help us to, help ourselves to come into like a little bit more like clear thinking. But then there are these things that happen where we get triggered that are really like deeply rooted in our past. And like, for example, fear of criticism can be one of them. You could have gotten physically abused. You could have trauma, relational, all sorts of relational trauma. You might have had big T trauma, like something actually physically, like either you witnessed something horrible or something horrible happened to you. Any of these things can cause us to be triggered in present day. And often it's our partners that trigger those things. And you could say that it's by design. So I'm of the mind that when we get triggered, it is because it is actually a part of us that is calling us to look inside and to see pain from the past, to see ways we've disconnected from ourselves, to see ways that we've abandoned ourselves in order to keep ourselves safe, the ways we've cut off from our body because maybe it felt unsafe to be in our body, the ways that we learn to cope with difficult things that happened to us as a child. And when we get triggered, it's actually some part of us that's saying we are ready to look at that thing that we compartmentalized, and we're ready to heal it and integrate it back into our being so that we can come into more wholeness, so we can feel more aliveness, and so we can be more true to ourselves and live more fully. So if that's something you want for yourself and your partner, then my invitation is that you help them when they have flipped their lid and they are in their amygdala rather than in their prefrontal cortex. Or I guess another way to communicate that is that their amygdala and their prefrontal cortex aren't communicating as well because their amygdala is sending fear messages to the prefrontal cortex, and the prefrontal cortex is not able to process it quickly enough to come back and say, no, this isn't a dangerous situation. We need to support one another, to use our triggers as opportunities to learn how to heal from our pasts and how to love ourselves more and how to be able to show up more truly authentic in the world. And so what does that mean for a couple? Well, so it does mean that ideally, if you notice that your partner is triggered, that you allow them not only space, but loving space. Meaning it's not just ignore them and let them go deal with their stuff, but perhaps there's a way that you can gently help them to notice when they're triggered. There can be a way that you can say, maybe even I see that you're feeling really upset right now, and I don't think you would say those things to me if you weren't feeling so upset and maybe even a little triggered right now. Telling somebody that they're triggered can be triggering, so you have to be a little careful. But maybe there's a way that you can actually walk them over to the couch and just sit with them and maybe invite them to take a few breaths. An exhale, an elongated exhale is one of the most amazing ways to go from a highly activated sympathetic nervous system response where your heart is racing and you're kind of angry, and then dial it down, bring it down like into the parasympathetic nervous system, which you may have heard me say before, the parachute. Parasympathetic guides you down into your body and into a calmer state. So maybe they can help you with that. Perhaps they can turn on the meditation, the You've Just Been Triggered meditation that I've recorded, and go help them to sit down and listen to it. One of the challenges with being triggered, especially when you're in a fight response, is that often you can't be reasoned with. So the person has to be pretty creative and not take personally what's happening with you. So my invitation is, if you tend to be with a person who has a little bit more of a fight energy in them, when they get triggered, you may have to get creative, but one of the most important things you can do is not throw fuel on the fire by getting your triggered response into the mix. Now, I am positive that is not an easy thing. And if you tend to be more of a fight also, it is going to be very hard to do that. You'll have to work very hard together to break that cycle, to notice that tiny little nanosecond between stimulus, whatever happened, and your reaction, and find that response time so that one of you can kind of claim to say, hey, do you think maybe we could take a break and come back and talk about this later? If you tend to be the kind of person who is more of a flight, that means that you tend to want to leave, and sometimes you might vacate emotionally, or you might physically want to leave. It's on you at that point to, if you can, to be able to tell that person who's in fight that you're not abandoning them, that you do want to talk about this, but that you need to take a moment to calm down a little bit before you want to talk any further, because you don't want either one of you to do anything that you will regret or hurt the other person. Yeah, so you see that it can be really difficult to navigate this, because if one person is triggered and the other one isn't, it's a lot easier to be in support of that person. When both people get triggered, it does create kind of a perfect storm, right? So what I've come to see is that in the situation where both people are triggered, there is usually a time where one person starts to kind of notice what's going on a little bit. So I like to say that there just needs to be one person, that the first person who notices, and you can't get into a competition, it might be the same person for a long time that notices. The first person that notices ideally will begin to use their breath to calm themselves down enough to be able to perhaps say, do you think maybe we need to take a break here? Or, I notice I'm triggered and it would help me to take a break here. Would you be willing for us to come back later, maybe after dinner, and sit down and talk about this after we've had a chance to just calm our nervous systems a little bit? So the more responsibility you can take, the better, because if you're saying to the other person that they're triggered, it does sometimes backfire. But my invitation is to do the best you can to notice that the situation is not a productive situation, because there's a lot of being triggered going on. And that there is very rarely any good communication that happens in the midst of a trigger. And so a lot of couples will tell me that they're very bad at communication, but I've come to see that that's not always the case. It's often that they're just not good at communicating when they're in the heat of the moment, in an actual triggered moment, in a fight. And that is actually not unusual. I don't know of anyone who's a good communicator in the midst of being triggered. Now, if you're being triggered in an actual dangerous situation, there are some people who can mobilize, and they just get they channel the fight response into hyper productive, super clear. They can, you could be in the midst of a hurricane or a tornado or something like that, and they know exactly what to do. Do this, do that, fix this, do that. They channel it really well. But there is something different that happens when you're in an emotional, psychological trigger. Those triggers tend to be incredibly fear-based, very, very young parts of us that get activated, and we don't have all of our capacity, and we are very limited, and we tend to be very reactive. We tend to, even fleeing, right, is a reaction of self-protection. And so we go into coping strategies that wouldn't be typical for us. We maybe get meaner, or we'll abandon a person that we would never abandon. We begin to think we don't love that person that's in front of us. We lose our ability to have empathy. And so that can be a pretty big rupture in our relationship. So the more that we can actually take space from one another, give ourselves a time out when a person, when we or the other or both of us are in at that hyper triggered state, the more that we can actually do less harm to one another. So Viktor Frankl has the quote, which is, between a stimulus and response, there is a space. And I can't exactly remember. And in that space is your power to choose how to respond. And it's not exactly that. I didn't fully get it, but you get the gist. And this is a man who is in concentration camps. And he said that the one thing that you cannot take away from me is my ability to choose how to respond in a situation. Now, this is a man who was tortured and starved and watched all of his family and friends be literally killed and incinerated. And this is a horrible situation. And he said, no way are you going to take away from that part of me that's going to choose to be more humane and to not become you, to not become a jaded, bitter person. And that took a lot of power, inner control and power. And what my encouragement is for you is, I don't believe that the way we get through triggers is by like willfully stopping ourselves from being triggered. We get through our triggers by understanding the root causes of our triggers, healing, building the strength of our parasympathetic nervous system if we tend to be a fight or flight person, to understand polyvagal theory and healing and understanding the freeze response, to understand our nervous systems and to really bring it into part of being a human being. And then really coming to the place where we don't choose our response from a place of willpower. We choose our response because we have actually come to a place where we're not as triggered anymore, where we actually can notice when we feel triggered, and we notice that we don't want to be that person that that loses our ability to have empathy for another person. We don't want to dehumanize the people we love when we are triggered, because that's what triggering does, is it causes us to dehumanize another person in the act of self-preservation. So knowing that we all get triggered, and that is an actual human response, and that being triggered is an actual involuntary self-preservation, self-protection mechanism that is wonderful, and we don't want to get rid of it. We just want to understand when we're emotionally and psychologically triggered, we want to get to the root cause of it. We want to heal down there in our hearts, our inner children. We want to do the work to fortify ourselves. We want to understand our nervous system and how it works so that we can be a more empowered person. But we don't need to shame ourselves. We have to hold both, right? Like, everyone gets triggered, and it's our responsibility to do the best we can, to do the work internally so that we don't harm other people when we get triggered. And then when we harm other people, we harm ourselves anyway. And so we don't want to harm. We don't want to cause more harm in this world if we can get a grip around our triggers, and if we can support our loved ones in getting a grip around their triggers. So the best we can do is actually ask the other person, when you get triggered, how can I be most supportive? And I know the first answer is, please don't let my triggers trigger you. That is a really, really helpful thing. If you can keep center while another person maybe gives you feedback, maybe does something that feels like a criticism, but maybe you can say, calm yourself down and say, this person is just giving me their opinion. Their opinion doesn't mean that they're right. It doesn't mean that I'm wrong. I get to listen with curiosity and try to hear what they're saying. Or perhaps that you can, when they start to say something, if you notice yourself triggered, perhaps you can say, I notice this is triggering me, and I need to take a couple of breaths before I can continue listening. It's okay to feel triggered when someone brings something to you that is bringing up stuff from your past. The more we have conscious awareness in the moment, the more that we're able to become better communicators, be able to ask for what we need. It is really 100% okay to say I need a break. It is 100% okay to say I can't actually respond to this right now because I feel like anything I would say would not be coming from a place of me being compassionate or empathetic. I would be coming from a reactive place. And we both have to be willing to participate. So my invitation is that you have a conversation about your conversations. It's called the meta discussion about triggers. Have a conversation about this. Talk about how the two of you can support each other. And I'm going to tell you, it is not going to happen overnight. It's not going to be easy. You will, if you are in the pattern of one person saying one thing, the other person reacting, and then getting triggered, and then making up a story about what that means, and kind of going into this like ruminating, blaming kind of place. And the two of you get, angry and stay angry for a while. And then you come back finally and you apologize, but you really never got to the root of the trigger. That's your pattern, it's going to take some time to unwind this. It's the real key is, do you want to make a commitment to both understand what is your go-to? Do you tend to be more of a fighter? Do you tend to be more of a fleer? When you get into an argument, you may want to look up, there's a video in YouTube called The Drama Triangle. In fact, I think it's in the training zone. If you search Drama Triangle, you'll be able to find the video, I think, somewhere in here. The drama triangle is also the triangle where there are three positions when you're in your kind of ego defense mechanism. There's a hero, a perpetrator, and a victim, and we often are kind of moving around them. The way that they get beyond that is to turn into a pyramid and come up above it and be able to see what's happening and then say we need a break because we're in the drama triangle. We are in our triggers. And so it's not going to be a simple thing because you have to first create that awareness, right? You have to become aware that you are triggered and be able to have enough sanity of your mind to be able to say the best thing we can do is take a break. So there's a lot in here, and I realize there's a lot, and I realize that, understanding your own natural go-to fear response is something that you probably, you may know I tend to just need to retreat, and I tend to want to fight. And I'm telling you, it is incredibly common to have these patterns. And by the way, the patterns get created. There's no shame in those patterns either, because they got created through the ways that you learned to cope as a child. And you may find you have a different fear response. Like for me, I tended to have a flee response and even a freeze response and a people-pleasing fawn response with my female friends. And yet with my husband, I was much more of a fight. So understanding what your typical response is will help you to understand what your physiology is doing. So the reason why that's important to know is because one of the things that can happen between people who tend to have, like, say a fight, and then someone who has either flee or freeze, what can happen is the fight person can get very activated by by the person going quiet. But what's happening for the person who goes quiet is often they feel either paralyzed, they don't know what to say, they are shut down, they are feeling like they need to go protect themselves. So the person who's the fight tends to be a little bit more like quick thinking, meaner, sharper tongued, has something to say. They're kind of like boom, 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 and they're making up stories. They're like, you're doing this and you're doing that, and that person who's the flee or the fawn, or the flee, sometimes the fawn, the flee, the faint, or the freeze, can be so overwhelmed by that person's response that they feel their only thing they can do is run away. Now, ultimately, the person who tends to want to flee will want to practice breathing and coming into presence. Just like the fight person is going to want to practice breathing and kind of calming down from that like heightened anger kind of place, that super protective, armored up place. And then you guys come into being able to have a conversation. But it could start by taking 2 weeks. It could be like getting shorter and shorter and shorter until eventually you could be in the midst of a trigger and notice your response, take a breath, say, I feel a little triggered right now, and kind of calm and be able to stay present with each other. That could take years to get there, though. And there was one other thing I wanted to say about... Now freeze is a little bit different in some ways. Freeze actually is a little bit different part of your body, and I'm not going to get totally into that right now, but when people have a freeze response, often they literally do feel paralyzed, and they are completely, like, they're numb, they can't they cannot take in what you're talking about often, and they feel very frozen. That is actually a super deep fear. It can be from trauma. And so my suggestion is to have some compassion for one another's fear responses. They come from wounding. And to the extent that you can realize that when a person is in freeze and you're in fight, if you come above in the drama triangle and you start to notice what's happening, the more you can create a safer space for that person, the more you increase the chances that over time they're going to thaw out a little. But my thought is anyone who tends to be a freeze, and all of us have a little bit of that, is that begin to do some healing work. You may want to work with someone who does somatic experiencing, which is body-centered healing. I had to do some work on my freeze response, and it took a lot of time. It took working with people who have an exquisite sense for the subtleties of our bodies and being able to sit patiently as you thaw tiny little parts of you that had to get frozen to protect you, ways that you had to cut off from your body. So last but not least, that's what I want to talk about, is this idea of that I think that this piece of having compassion for ourselves, compassion for our partners, realizing that all of this is rooted in old traumas, and that one of the things I have seen, and there may be people who disagree with me, but it was true for me, and I've seen it over and over again, is that often the fight person, so there's this interesting thing that happens. So the flee person, even sometimes the freeze, and definitely the fawn too, can sometimes look like the more evolved person because they don't say things they regret. They just get quiet. They look like they're the more introspective person, but actually they're still in a fear response as well. The person who's fighting often looks like the person, I was the fight, so I know, looks like the crazy person, the person who's like the mean person, the person who can be so like just utterly incompassionate, non-compassionate. And I always said that it looked like I was the bad guy. I always look like the bad guy. He looks like he's the good guy. But he was in a fear response too. And it doesn't matter, but I'm just calling out some of the things that I know happen. And one of the things that I have seen is that often it does take the person who is the more fight-oriented person to heal more and then be less mean or less sharp with their tongue, less quick with what they say, for them to dial it back a little in order to be able to create the space for that person who tends to flee to feel safe, to begin to bring their voice to the conversation. And what happens is, one of the things that incenses the fight person the most is the person that is fleeing and says nothing. And they get so angry because they look at it and say, why don't you feel angry? Why don't you feel anything? Why are you so disconnected? Why are you running away from me? Why are you abandoning me? Just stay with this. But they don't realize that that person actually is basically unable to do that. And so the more that the fight person creates a safer environment, what will happen is all of the others will be able to, like all of the other fear responses will feel a little safer. Now, I'm not saying that that comes easily. Being a person who is a fight person, in my relationship, it took a long time for me to get where my nervous system was regulated enough. And I had done enough healing that I didn't need to bring my swords to every single every single conflict. So the more that we can start to put our swords away in our whatever they're called behind us, and we can, is it sheaths? And we can try to come with a little bit more presence, the more that the other person begins to bring their voice. And I began to intentionally create safer space for my husband to share by breathing and inviting and basically assuring him that I was calm enough to be able to listen without scaring the crap out of him, because I'm sure that's what I did. So those are some of my thoughts. I would love to hear what you have to say in the comments, because I can make more videos to address any of your questions or answer your questions in the comments. And so I hope this helps you. I will try to clean this up more and maybe create a worksheet around this and some other processes for us, but this is a good starting place, I think, for any of you couples who want the support around it. The thing you're going to have to do, though, is have this conversation. So if you've listened to this all the way through, and you've listened by yourself and you want to invite your partner to listen as well, I would invite you to sit down with a cup of coffee or your favorite drink and listen to this together and make an agreement to try to support one another in working through your triggers, because when you do, I promise you, the world changes. The possibilities for your relationship are limitless, but it's triggers that are often getting in the way. And there are some physical things too. I mean, I would definitely recommend doing things like trying to get into at least a little bit of like a meditation practice, maybe a journaling practice, perhaps getting good sleep, nourishing yourself, eating well, moving your body, managing your stress. There are a lot of factors that contribute to our limited capacity around triggers. And so the more we can create space, the more that we don't tend to be as reactive and quick to judge. Because triggers are funny, because right, there are triggers that are from our past, but there are also things that are triggers, like if you didn't get enough sleep, if you are stressed out at work, if you don't feel like you're being appreciated in your home, if you feel bitter about something, so there are all these other things that can be like other ways we get like environmental triggers, I guess you could say. And those things need to be, or if you're hungry, hunger absolutely can be. So think about those things too. All right, so put your comments below though, because I will respond to them and be happy to kind of coach you through other ways that you're kind of getting tripped up as you and your partner are trying to work through these little pesky triggers. All right, thanks.